The river came up in the night. By morning, it had swallowed the low fence on the eastern pasture, climbed the bank to within 4 feet of the road, and turned the shallow crossing at Miller's Ford into something that moved like it was alive and angry. Clemson Hale stood at the edge of it in his work boots at 7:30, watching a wooden crate spin past in the current, and thought about the fact that his daughter had not answered her phone in 19 hours. He had told himself around midnight that the signal had probably dropped. The ridge between their two farms killed reception in wet weather, and there had been a lot of wet weather. He had told himself around 3 in the morning that she was a grown woman of 34, and that grown women of 34 sometimes forgot to charge their phones. He had told himself, getting out of bed before the sun with the rain still hammering the tin roof, that the road would still be passable, and he would drive over and find her in her kitchen with a cup of tea, mildly annoyed at him for worrying. But the road was not passable. The water at Miller's Ford was chest deep on a man, moving at a speed that would pull your legs out before you had gone 6 feet, carrying branches and debris at a pace that did not allow for mistakes. The nearest bridge was 42 miles east, which meant at least 2 hours by truck, on a route that might itself be compromised. Clemson stood at the edge of the river with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the other side. His daughter's farm was over there, 2 miles past the tree line. He knew the layout of it by heart, had walked every acre of it with her when she signed the papers 4 years ago, had helped her fix the barn roof the summer before last, had eaten more meals at that kitchen table than he could count. He knew where she kept the spare key, where the circuit breaker was, which stall the goats used in heavy rain. He could not get there. That should have been the end of it in the rational accounting of the situation. He should have walked back to his truck, driven the 42 miles east, taken the long route, and found her safe when he arrived. Any reasonable man would have done exactly that. But then he looked down the bank. 50 yards south of where he stood, at a bend in the river where the willows hung low over the water and the current moved differently because of the way the land curved inward, something was standing in the shallows on the near bank. Clemson Hale went very still. It was a gray horse. A gray horse with a white stripe running from its forehead to its muzzle, standing perfectly motionless in the flooded shallows, looking directly at him. He knew that horse. He had buried that horse 23 months ago in the north pasture of his own farm, under the oak tree his wife had planted the year they were married. He had dug the grave himself, in hard clay, in September heat, when the ground had not yet softened into autumn. He had covered the grave with field stones, so that no scavenger could disturb it. He had stood there for a long time afterward, not moving, not knowing exactly what he was waiting for, only knowing he was not ready to leave. The horse's name had been Gable. Clemson took 3 steps toward the bend in the river. The wet grass was slippery under his boots. He was aware of the sound of the flood on his right, the constant roar of it, and underneath that sound, silence. The horse did not move, did not startle, did not look away. He stopped and stood in the gray morning light with the river between him and his daughter's land, looking at an animal that could not be standing in front of him. Later, when people asked him what he did next, he would have trouble answering, not because the memory was unclear. It was perfectly clear, but because the answer involved following a dead horse along a flooding river, and that answer had a way of making conversations awkward. What he did was follow the horse. Clemson Hale was 68 years old, and he had lived on the same 200 acres in eastern Tennessee his entire life. He had been born in the farmhouse where he still slept, had learned to walk in the kitchen where he still ate breakfast, had watched the same ridgeline change color through the same window across 68 years of seasons. He knew the land the way some people know a face they have loved for a long time, not because they have memorized it, but because it has become part of how they understand everything else. He was a farmer, and a good one, which meant he was a man who understood consequence. You plant, you cultivate, you harvest. You make decisions. The decisions have outcomes, and the outcomes are your responsibility. There is not much room in that worldview for things that cannot be explained, and Clemson had never felt the lack of it. His wife, Dorothea, had been different in this way. She had a quality of perception that went sideways from the practical, that noticed things operating at angles he could not see. She called it attentiveness, not intuition, because she was careful with language and did not like claiming more than she could demonstrate. But she would sometimes say, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, that something felt off, and she would be right in ways that Clemson could never fully account for. Clemson sees what is in front of him, she used to tell people, with that mixture of affection and gentle exasperation that he came to think of as her most characteristic expression. She would follow this with something like, "The rest of us have to fill in what he misses." He had missed her for 4 years, every single day, in the particular way that only comes from living alongside someone long enough that their absence reshapes the entire texture of ordinary life. The sound of her in the kitchen in the morning, the way she organized the bookshelves by something other than the obvious systems, which he had never fully decoded. The fact that she had always answered his unasked questions before he knew he was asking them. After she died, Clemson had learned to live in a smaller way. He had kept the farm running because the farm needed running. He had eaten and slept and worked and talked to people when talking was required. On the surface, everything continued. But the farm was quieter than it used to be, and not just because Dorothea was not in it. There was a quality to the quiet that was different from ordinary quiet, a quality that felt sometimes like waiting, though Clemson could not have said what for. His daughter Lena had moved across the river partly because she wanted her own land, and partly, he suspected, because she understood the quality of that quiet and wanted to reduce it. She was 34 and had come back from 12 years in Knoxville, where she had worked as a land surveyor, with enough savings for a down payment and a specific clarity about what kind of life she wanted. The farm on the west side of the river, with its old barn and its 2 usable pastures, and its view of the same ridge from the other direction, had been available, and she had moved quickly, the way people who know their own minds tend to move. She called every other day. Sometimes the calls were 2 minutes. Sometimes they were longer. She came for dinner on Sundays when the weather permitted. She had fixed the hinge on his barn door one afternoon without being asked and was gone before he came back from the field to thank her. She sent him texts sometimes that were simply photographs, the ridge in morning light, her goats in the snow, a hawk she had seen. This was Lena's language. Proximity and small documented beauty. He had not heard that language in 19 hours. The horse Gable had come to Clemson 12 years ago from a farm sale. A gray Tennessee walking horse that arrived at 5 years old with a reputation for steadiness that turned out to be entirely accurate. Gable was not dramatic. He did not spook at things that other horses spooked at, did not require the management of anxious animals, did not need to be convinced to do what was being asked of him. He simply moved through the world with a kind of fundamental calm that Clemson had always found, in the right mood, to be extremely good company. In the years after Dorothea died, Clemson had ridden Gable more than he had any practical reason to. There was fence line that could be checked by truck. There were pastures that did not require a horse to inspect. But he had saddled Gable on most mornings anyway, and ridden the perimeter of the farm in the early light, because the motion of it helped, and the silence was different on horseback, more deliberate, more inhabited. Gable had died in September, 23 months ago, from colic that progressed faster than Clemson's vet could get there to treat. It had been a bad night, one of those nights that feel very long and very small simultaneously, and by morning the outcome was clear. Clemson had not watched this with the numbness he had expected. He had felt it with a sharpness that surprised him, as though something had been holding space for the grief that had not yet been fully spent on Dorothea and had found a way out. He had buried the horse alone. He had not called anyone. He had not wanted to explain. The horse did not bolt. That was the first thing that registered in the practical animal logic part of Clemson's brain that could not be suspended even now. A loose horse in flood conditions, confronted by an approaching man, should have shown some sign of the alertness that horses show, should have shifted, should have turned, should have assessed the approach. The gray horse did not move. Clemson stopped 6 feet away and looked at it in the fog and the morning rain. Up close, the gray of the coat was the color he remembered, the color of old pewter in certain light, darker along the neck and lighter at the flanks. The white stripe ran from the center of the forehead exactly to the tip of the muzzle, the way it had always run. The eyes were the dark, steady brown that had been looking at him for 12 years, and they were looking at him now with an expression that he did not have a name for and made a conscious choice not to interpret. He stood and he thought, with the part of his mind that was still conducting a rational assessment of the morning, that there were gray horses with white blazes everywhere in this county, that the fog was thick, that he had been awake since before 3, that a man under this kind of stress, looking across a flooding river at a farm he could not reach, would impose familiar shapes onto whatever was in front of him. This was a reasonable explanation. It was a reasonable explanation, and he was a man who believed in reasonable explanations. He reached out his hand. The horse pressed its muzzle against his palm, and the warmth of it moved through his hand, the way warmth moves through something that has been cold for a long time, and settled in his chest in a place he recognized. He stood there with his palm against that warm muzzle, and the river roared beside them, and the fog moved slowly over the water, and Clemson Hale did not try to explain it. Then the horse took 2 steps south along the bank and turned and looked at him. Clemson followed. For 600 yards, the gray horse moved south along the river bank at a deliberate walk, keeping a distance of roughly 20 feet ahead that never varied significantly. When Clemson's boot caught in the sedge grass and he stumbled, the horse stopped entirely and waited until he had regained his footing, then started again. The fog sat close to the water, reducing visibility to perhaps 30 yards in the direction of the river, but the bank itself was clear. They moved through it together, man and horse, with the sound of the current on their right and the smell of wet soil and flood debris in the cold air. Clemson did not think about what this was. He had made, somewhere in the first seconds of following, a pragmatic decision that thinking about what this was would not help him get to his daughter. And getting to his daughter was the operational objective. The nature of the thing guiding him was a question for a calmer moment. There are times when the mind steps to the side and lets the body carry the situation, and this was one of those times. At the 600-yard mark, where the river curved and the bank dropped to a wide gravel shelf that sat 3 feet above the waterline even now, the horse stopped. Clemson came up beside it and looked at the river. This stretch of water was different from Miller's Ford. The curve of the land here created a backwater effect, a slowing and widening of the current, a place where the river had to renegotiate its energy before the channel narrowed again downstream. The water was still moving, still cold, still well above normal depth, but there were rocks visible under the surface at the shallow end of the bend, old flat-topped rocks placed at intervals that, once you saw them, were clearly not random. Stepping stones, placed at deliberate intervals across the widest and slowest section of the bend, partially buried in the silt and gravel from decades of flooding, but solid, still there, still offering the specific geometry of an intentional crossing. Clemson stood at the bank's edge and looked at them and understood several things in rapid succession. He understood that he had not known this crossing existed. He had walked this bank before in dry conditions, but apparently not this far south, and not in a season when the water level would reveal stones that spent most of the year fully submerged. He understood that someone had built this crossing deliberately, with considerable physical effort and an understanding of water behavior that had allowed them to choose exactly the right location. He understood that whoever had built it to be used in conditions exactly like these. The gray horse walked into the water without hesitation and stopped at the first stone, and Clemson stood on the bank for exactly 3 seconds before he made his decision. He took off his jacket, wrapped his phone in it, tucked the bundle inside his shirt against his skin. He checked that the small pry bar on his belt was secure. Then he stepped off the bank into the river. The cold was immediate and total, the kind of cold that takes your breath before you have decided whether to give it. The current grabbed his boots and pulled sideways and down, the coordinated pull of moving water that knows how to find the weak point in a man's balance. For 3 seconds, Clemson was not certain that this was going to work. Then his foot found the first stone, solid, flat, exactly where he needed it to be. He moved from stone to stone with his left hand resting on the horse's shoulder when the current surged. And when the current surged, the horse absorbed it without moving, a wall of steadiness that did not shift no matter how hard the water pushed. 12 crossings of water, 12 stones, 12 moments of finding the next footing before the current finished pulling at the last one. The river was waist deep at the center, which was worse than chest deep because it left his hands free to do nothing, to not catch him if he fell. He moved through the waist deep section with both hands on the horse's neck and did not look down. 12 minutes after he stepped off the bank, he climbed out on the other side. He turned around to look at the horse. It was standing on the eastern bank, the bank he had come from, standing in the exact spot it had been standing when he first crossed, as though it had never entered the water, as though the 12 minutes of river crossing had happened without it, as though the warmth of its shoulder under his hand was something he had imagined or misremembered. Clemson stood on the west bank with the cold river water draining from his clothes and looked at the gray horse on the far shore for a long moment. Then he heard his daughter's voice. Not screaming. That was the first thing he registered. Not in the acute register of panic or injury, but in the specific register of someone who has been doing the same thing for a long time and has made a decision to keep doing it. Rhythmic, deliberate. A sound that said, I am here. I am still here. I have not stopped. He ran. The 2 miles from the river to Lena's farm was the kind of running that is not about speed, because the ground would not allow speed, but about continuity. The bottom land was soft from the flooding, and twice he went down to his knee in standing water and got up and kept moving. His wet clothes were heavy. His boots made sounds in the mud that he would remember afterward, a particular percussion that had its own feeling in it. The barn came into view through the trees at just under 2 miles, and the sound resolved as he got closer, knocking, steady and deliberate, and underneath it her voice. Not a scream, not a cry, simply a word, Papa, said with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who does not need to raise their voice because they know they are being heard. He found the latch in 3 seconds of examination and understood in another 3 what had happened to it. The way it had bent under the force of the wind and jammed against the strike plate. He used the pry bar from his belt. He had to work it for 3 minutes, adjusting the angle twice before the mechanism gave. The door swung open. A foot of water rolled over his boots and out into the grass. Lena was standing inside on top of a wooden feed chest, with a nail in one hand and her phone in the other. And the expression on her face when the door opened was the expression of someone who knew this was going to happen, who had been certain of it for a specific number of minutes, and who was now watching the thing they were certain of arrive exactly on schedule. She stepped down from the feed chest into the standing water. She crossed the barn floor. She put her arms around his neck, and Clemson Hale held his daughter with both arms in the open barn door, with the flood water still draining around their feet, and the rain coming down soft now, softer than it had been, and neither of them said anything for a long time. When she finally pulled back and looked at him, she looked at the state of his clothes, the river mud on his jacket, the way he was soaked from the waist down, and she said the same thing she had been saying to him since she was 8 years old when he came home from difficult situations, which was, how bad was it? He told her it was fine. She looked at him the way her mother used to look at him, which was a specific look that communicated a complete and patient disbelief. He said he would tell her later. What she had been dealing with was this. She had gone to the barn at 7 the previous evening to check on her 2 goats, because the weather radio had put the county under a flood watch, and she had learned, in 4 years of farming alone, that preparation was not something you did after the event. The goats were restless from the weather, which was normal, and she was settling them with feed and calm when the wind came off the ridge at a speed she had not been expecting. The barn door blew shut. The external latch, which she had been meaning to repair since spring, caught in the closed position with a force that embedded it, and she was in the barn with her goats, in a single work light and no reliable signal on her phone, and a storm developing outside that was moving considerably faster than the forecast had suggested. She had tried the window first. The single high window on the south wall had swollen shut with the moisture, and she spent 30 minutes working at its frame with the only thing that came to hand, the nail she had been using to hang a length of rope that morning. The window did not move. She had tried the door latch from inside with a screwdriver from the bucket where she kept tools, working it for an hour and 40 minutes by her phone's clock before conceding that the geometry of the mechanism did not allow for interior manipulation. She had tried her phone at intervals, getting a half bar of signal twice in the first 3 hours, losing both before a call could connect. She had sent 3 texts to her father's number. She did not know if they had gone through. She had sent 1 text to her neighbor, Prue Collister, 3 miles east, but had no way to know if Prue had received it. After midnight, she had organized the barn for the wait. She had put the goats in the highest stall. She had moved the feed chest to the center of the floor and positioned herself on it with the blanket she kept in the barn for cold weather work. She had inventoried her situation with the kind of clear-eyed practicality that she had inherited directly from her father, which was, she was not in immediate danger. The barn was structurally sound. The flood risk was real, but manageable if the water did not exceed the level of the chest, and someone would come. Someone would come. She had held on to that fact, not as a comfort, but as a data point. Her father checked on her. He would have tried to call. He would have known when the call did not connect. He would make choices based on that knowledge. She had trusted those choices in the dark. The water had come under the door sometime around 3 in the morning. She had tracked its rise with the nail, scratching a mark into the concrete wall every 20 minutes. The way a person marks the progress of something they are monitoring carefully, because they are not ready to be afraid yet, but are keeping the information available in case they need to become afraid quickly. By 6 a.m., the water stood at 8 inches, and the rise had slowed but not stopped. That was when she heard something outside. She had been in a light half-sleep, conserving energy, her ear tuned to the rise of the water, level in the way that you tune yourself to a sound that matters. She came awake fully and quickly, and she heard it through the concrete wall, a sound that her exhausted mind took 3 seconds to name. Hooves, moving slowly, moving from north to south, along the outside of the barn wall, at the measured pace of something that knew where it was, and was not in a hurry. She heard the sound stop, somewhere near the south corner of the barn, and there was a pause of perhaps 30 seconds in which she sat on the feed chest and did not breathe in the way she was used to breathing. She told herself it was a deer. The flooding pushed deer out of the bottom land, and she had seen them in places they did not normally go. She told herself it was debris in the water, something moving along the barn's exterior drainage line. But it had stopped. Right there, outside the south wall. Unhurried, she put her hand against the concrete. She would describe this moment later to her father, sitting at his kitchen table, in simple and specific terms that she had thought about before she said them. She would say that she put her hand against the wall, and she felt, through the concrete, something she had no instrument to measure, and no label to put on, and no rational means of verifying, which was the fact of something known being on the other side. Then the hoofbeats resumed, moving south, moving toward the river, growing quieter. She had picked up the nail. She had started knocking, not because she thought the sound had called anyone. She was her father's daughter, and magical thinking was not her natural register. But because the deliberate pause outside that wall had landed in her with the specific weight of a signal, and the signal said that the gap between her situation and a resolution was closing, and the correct response to that signal was to make noise. She had knocked steadily for 40 minutes until the latch gave and the door opened, and her father was standing there. Clemson did not tell her about the horse until that evening. By then, the county road crew had come through and helped them both cross the river at the bridge, and Lena's barn had been assessed and found structurally sound, and the goats were unharmed, and the watermark on the barn wall stood at 14 inches, which was 4 inches below the top of the feed chest. They were sitting at Clemson's kitchen table with coffee and in the particular quietness of people who have been very close to something and come out the other side of it when he told her. He told her exactly what he had seen. The horse at the bend, the white stripe, the warmth against his palm, the crossing, the horse on the far bank when he climbed out. Lena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at her coffee cup for a long moment. Then she told him about the hoofbeats outside the barn wall. Clemson sat with this. Outside, the river was audible from the kitchen window, lower now, still moving fast, but no longer carrying that frantic edge that a flood in full force has. That sound of something that has forgotten how to be itself. It sounded like a river again. He asked her what she thought it was. She was quiet for a while. Then she said she was a land surveyor, which was a profession built on measurement and precision, and that she tried not to make claims she could not support with data. But she had been thinking in the barn, in the hours between the sound outside the wall and the door opening, about the fact that there were things that animals perceived that human instruments did not register: infrasound, magnetic fields, changes in pressure and moisture that arrived ahead of any forecast. She had been thinking about the way her father's horse, in the 12 years Clemson had owned it, had demonstrated a consistent and documented capacity to notice things before the people around it noticed them. She did not say the word that was implicit in all of this. Neither of them said it. It was not the kind of word either of them used. But it sat between them on the table with the coffee cups and the evening quiet, and neither of them moved it. 2 weeks later, Lena called him on a Tuesday morning with a particular tone in her voice that meant she had found something. She had gone into the county records, she said. Practical, like him. She had wanted to know the history of the stepping stones at the river bend. Because she was a land surveyor, and unaccounted for infrastructure in a river crossing was the kind of thing she could not leave as an open question. What she found was this. The parcel of land along the south bend of the river, on the east bank, had belonged until 1984 to a family named Hale. Clemson went quiet, not his farm. A different parcel, on the south side, sold in a land division that had been made by his grandfather, whose estate had been divided among 3 siblings after his death in 1981. The land had passed out of the family name and been sold and resold several times since. But in 1984, when it was sold, it had been Howell land. And the county survey document from 1961, which Lena had found in the records room, noted, in the dry bureaucratic language of county surveyors, An informal river crossing at the bend of Miller's Creek at the South Holly property line, maintained by the landowner for seasonal access to West Bank pasture. Maintained by the landowner. His grandfather had built those stones. Clemson sat in his kitchen for a long time after the phone call, looking at the window that faced the ridgeline his grandfather had looked at from the other side of 65 years. He had known very little about this man. His grandfather had died before Clemson was born. What Clemson knew came from his mother, who had said that he was a man who did not make promises he did not intend to keep, who could read weather from the behavior of livestock before the sky showed any sign, and who had built things to last because he did not see the point of doing it any other way. He had built a river crossing in a flood bend. He had built it in the right place, with the right stones, at the right depth for a man to stand on them, and he had built it to last, and it had lasted 60-some years. He had built it for access to West Bank pasture. He had built it for the reasons a farmer builds a crossing, which are practical and land-based, and have nothing to do with grandchildren he would never meet or daughters who would need to be reached on a flooded morning. And yet, Clemson went out to the north pasture in the late afternoon, to the grave under the oak tree. The fallen branch that had dropped in the flood was still there across the stones. He had not moved it, and he did not move it now. The leaves on it had gone fully brown, dry at the edges, held in place by the weight of the branch. He stood at the grave. He did not know what to say, which had been true both times he had stood here before. And so he stood in the particular silence that comes with that condition, the silence of a man with something large in him that has no exit. The ridge was visible from where he stood, the same ridge he had watched from the farmhouse window his entire life, and on the far side of it, though he could not see it from here, was the river, and on the other side of the river was his daughter's farm, and his daughter was in it. She was in it because he had crossed. He had crossed because he had followed a horse. The horse had known about the stones. Clemson was not a man who made interpretations beyond what the facts supported. He had tried, in the 2 weeks since the flood, to hold the sequence of events at the distance that a rational man maintains from things he cannot explain, and to acknowledge that grief does strange things to perception, and that he had been under stress, and that there were gray horses everywhere in this county. He had tried all of that, and then he had thought about Dorothea. He had thought about her phrase, "The world takes care." He had thought about the way she said it, not as a philosophical position, but as a practical observation, the kind of observation a farmer makes about weather or soil, or the behavior of animals that have been watched long enough to reveal patterns. Not mystical, not religious, exactly. Just a careful attention to the evidence that things, sometimes, lined up in ways that exceeded the randomness of accident. He had thought about his grandfather, building stones in a river bend in 1961, for reasons that were entirely practical and had nothing to do with a morning 61 years in the future. He had thought about a gray horse raising its head the way it used to raise it, by exactly that degree when someone it knew had been gone longer than usual. He had thought about his daughter's hand against a concrete wall, feeling something through the stone that she did not have an instrument to measure. The world takes care. He did not know if he believed it the way Dorothea had believed it, with the full, easy confidence of someone whose perception naturally moved sideways from the practical. He was a man who believed in what was in front of him, and what had been in front of him that morning was not something he could hold inside the ordinary frame. But he was 68 years old, and he had lived his whole life on land that was older than his family's name on it, and he had seen enough of what land and water and animal and time could do together to know that there were arrangements in the world that exceeded any single life's ability to plan for. His grandfather had built the stones. The horse had known where they were. He walked back through the north pasture as the light went out of the afternoon, toward the farmhouse where the kitchen window was lit and warm, and he did not know what any of it meant and he did not need to. On the Sunday after the flood, Lena came for dinner. She came early, which was unlike her, and she brought the photographs she had found in the county records, printed on copy paper with the 1961 survey document attached. She laid them on the kitchen table while Clemson made coffee, and he came over and looked at them. The survey map was hand-drawn in the style of the period, with property lines in ink and notations in a surveyor's careful hand. There was the river, curving at the bend. There was the Hall property line on the east bank, south of the main crossing at Miller's Ford. And there, at the bend, a small notation in the margin: informal crossing, flat stone, maintained. Informal crossing, flat stone, maintained. Clemson looked at the notation for a long time. He thought about his grandfather's hands on those stones, the work of placing them, each one, at the right depth and interval, the specific knowledge of river behavior required to choose that location, to know that the bend would slow the current enough to make it workable, to predict that the stones would hold and not wash downstream. His grandfather had never told anyone about the crossing, apparently. It was noted in the survey and then forgotten in the records. It had sat there for 61 years without being mentioned in any family conversation that Clemson had ever been part of. It had simply waited. Lena sat across the table and watched him look at the map. After a while, she said quietly that she had been thinking about the timing of it, that she had gone to the county records not just to document what had happened, but because she wanted to understand whether the position of the stones was as unusual as it had seemed to her father when he found it. She had consulted a hydrological study of the creek basin. She had looked at flood records going back 40 years. And the conclusion she had reached, as a trained land surveyor who understood water behavior, was that the location her grandfather had chosen for the crossing was the single optimal spot along that entire stretch of river for a flood crossing on foot. Not just good, optimal. The combination of the bend geometry, the backwater effect, a natural gravel shelf, and the depth profile during high water created a window that did not exist anywhere else along Miller's Creek. He had chosen the exact right place. He had chosen it in 1961, using nothing but observation and the kind of knowledge that comes from living alongside a piece of land long enough to understand how it behaves. Clemson sat with his coffee and his daughter's quiet voice and the hand-drawn survey map and the particular weight of all of it. Outside, the river had returned to its ordinary October level. The water was clear again, running cool over the rocks at Miller's Ford, and you would not know, looking at it now, what it had been 2 weeks ago. You would not know what it had done, or what had moved through the fog on its bank at 7:30 in the morning, in the gray light, heading south. He drove out to the grave one more time in November, on the morning of what would have been Dorothea's 66th birthday. He had gone every year on this date since she died, not because he was sentimental about anniversaries in the way some people are, but because the date marked a specific thing, and he believed in marking specific things. A fallen branch was still across the stones. He had continued to leave it. He was not sure why, except that it had fallen there and seemed to belong there. The way some things settle into place and make it clear they intend to stay. He stood at the grave in the November cold, with the oak bare now above him, and he said a few things quietly that he would not have been able to say in any company, things about how he understood now, somewhat better, what she had meant. Not everything. He was not claiming everything, but the thing about the world taking care. He thought he understood that better. He thought about the crossing he had made, and the stones under his feet in the cold, dark water, and the warmth on his palm on the bank before he entered the river. He thought about his daughter on the feed chest with a nail in her hand, listening to something move slowly along the south wall of her barn and putting her hand against the concrete. He thought about a man in 1961 placing stones in a river bend for practical reasons, building something that would last, because he did not see the point of doing it any other way. These were separate things. He was not making a claim, but they had lined up. On that particular morning, in that particular flood, for that particular man standing on the wrong side of the water with a daughter he could not reach, they had lined up. He stood at the grave until his hands were cold. Then he turned and walked back across the north pasture toward the house. In the pale November light, with the ridge visible above the tree line and the river audible in the distance, running quiet and ordinary, he did not look back. But somewhere behind him, in the still air of that November morning, the dry leaves on the fallen branch turned once in a wind that was not coming from any direction he could account for. And then they were still,